I'm Mary Sutton, poetry editor at West Trade Review. Joining me today for this special interview on gastronomy and poetry are the poets Joshua Martin and Brandon Kilbourne. Joshua has published 2 poems in our fall 2021 issue of West Trade Review, Why We Bake Bread and It's the Little Barbecue Joints I Like. Brandon Kilbourne will be publishing 1 poem as an online exclusive, Erinnerung. I think my German has held up a little bit there, Erinnerung. And we'll be publishing a Moqueca Chronicle in our print issue this spring. Joshua and Brandon, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really big honor.
And Brandon coming all the way, or joining us all the way from Berlin. Thank you, especially because of the time difference. I just want to jump right in. So both of you take a sort of Proustian approach to writing about food in poetry. That is, in your poems, Why We Bake Bread, particularly, and Moqueca Chronicle, you use food as a catalyst to explore, our history of, meaning the West's history of commerce and cultural exchange. Why do you think that food is so useful in this form of storytelling, especially in poetry, which might not be the most intuitive form when talking about, when talking about cultural exchange and commerce, particularly. And Brandon, we can start with you.
Okay. Well, for me, I think I guess the simplest explanation is that everyone has to eat, right? So it's a very common phenomenon. And I can think of sort of my own travels, going to different places, coming back. One of the first questions people will ask me about the place or the culture is, well, how was the food? So I think this is a very sort of common experience, like eating food, enjoying food, the pleasure of food. And so that's kind of maybe like a common denominator. But I guess the other thing is that everything has a past. And so even the most mundane, common things has some sort of a past. And they're not really existing independently in some sort of vacuum. And so we can, if you think of how different foodstuffs have traveled the world, how they've sort of gone from culture to culture, kind of the path they've woven through human history, it can connect a lot of dots between cultures in different time periods and different places. And so, I think that's it for me. And I guess the other thing is that because eating and just enjoying food is just like a human experience, I think the issue is also maybe a bit of one of resonance with poetry, because I'm not a novelist or a short story writer, but I think all pieces of writing have to have some issue of resonance with the reader, unless maybe it's some sort of sweeping epic novel. And that being said, I think because usually a poem is shorter than, say, on most occasions than a novel or short story or novella, that you have to have in a much more limited space a sense of resonance. And I think having food and sort of common experience of eating and enjoying food, I think that maybe that's one way to sort of quickly achieve a resonance in the piece.
Now, in Moqueca Chronicle, you have this very expansive view of food, and we'll get into this more later. But those who will read the poem in the print issue this spring will see that you take us through the trajectory of about 500 years of history and cuisine in that poem. Joshua, for you, it's barbecue is certainly connected to that lineage as well. But I think what you give us in your work is more, or for a lot of readers, I think would be more immediately relatable, arguably provincial, and I mean that in the best sense of that word. Can you talk a little bit about how this kind of storytelling works well for you in the poetic form?
Yeah, I think Brandon said it really well initially. Everybody likes to eat, or everybody needs to eat, right? And because of that, everybody has a visceral reaction to food at some point in their life, whether positive or negative. And normally that reaction is for me at least, it's almost sublime. It comes out of nowhere. Like when you taste something really, really good for the first time, I mean, it's almost an experience that transcends, um, I don't really, most things, I think. But that experience is fleeting too, until you take the next bite, until it's over, the meal is over. So there's a very finite amount of time for that, like really intense, pleasurable sensation. And I think a poem in its compression really captures that burst of energy really well. Not that novels and short stories can't, but I think I love praising food. I love the ode, and the ode works best, I think, when it is an outburst of energy over a short amount of time. And I think the best meals do the same thing, or the best, foods do the same thing. It gives this intense, almost like heavenly experience, and then it's over, and it leaves you wanting more, and then you go back for the dish again at some point.
Going back to you, Joshua, there was something very curious to me in the dedication of It's the Little Barbecue Joints. You dedicate the poem to the poet Thomas Lux, the late poet, Thomas Lux, who might not be very well known to a lot of readers. Lux, for those who don't know, was best known for his surrealist poems. He wrote a lot of work that dealt with his upbringing on his family farm in Northampton, Massachusetts. Incidentally, I went to college in Northampton, Massachusetts too, so I'm very familiar with the Connecticut River Valley. And Refrigerator 1957 is another one of Lux's poems, which is interesting because it deals with the very meager contents of his icebox. And given that it was the mid-century, we would have said icebox. How did Lux serve as an inspiration for this poem? Because I'm thinking particularly of the contrast between what he writes about Refrigerator 1957 and the richness of what you discuss in It's Little Barbecue Joints. I like in the fullness.
Yeah, I've always loved Thomas Lux's work. He said something in an interview one time, or might have been in writing, about how in a poem he wants to make you laugh or make you experience some kind of absurdist thing, and then take that moment of laughter away and put you in a moment of reflection, or even sadness at times. And what I love about his work, especially Refrigerator 1957, he uses something as innocuous as maraschino cherries to really dive into really, at first, hard-hitting truths about family exploration. And then you get to that final line, and because you do not eat that which rips your heart with joy. And so it gets into this really interesting philosophical question about saving things, and not using things because they might go away forever. And it's always fascinating. I've always liked the rhythm in his poetry, the way that he bounces around from these kind of absurdist images back to real life situations. I love his use of allegory, his work, and just his play, right? He's a very playful poet. He's not afraid to be funny and take a lot of really cool risks and make a lot of like imaginative leaps that I've always found really fascinating.
Recently, I'm thinking particularly about Michael Twitty's book, The Cooking Gene, and Stephen Satterfield's very popular Netflix special, High on the Hog, all in which Michael Twitty is also featured in the second episode. And a lot of this content has sparked an interest in the genesis of common American foods like barbecue, for example. And much of this food originated in slavery. This nation's, these being the United States, of course, this nation's legacy of slavery. And I think, this historical awareness is especially apparent in Brandon's poem, Moqueca Chronicle, which features a scene from the Middle Passage. How much, Brandon, did this this might be an obvious question, but how much did this historical awareness impact the writing of Moqueca Chronicle? And Joshua, I just want to prepare you because I'm also going to ask you how much of it affected the writing of the barbecue poem. Brandon?
Yeah, so Yeah, I mean, just sort of intrinsically, like, to the very core of the poem. And, I do cook a lot of Brazilian food, and my favorite dishes to cook in Brazilian food are usually the ones from the state of Bahia, which is usually called, or at least its capital, Bahia, Salvador, is usually called the Black capital of Brazil. Because there's a very strong influence from African cultures or West African cultures in Bahian culture. And so that was sort of my first interest in this cuisine, or this sort of connection to Africa, looking at Bahian cuisine. But then I wrote a poem really dealing more with natural history museums and their collections, tying into the Middle Passage and, these early naturalists in Europe using slave ships as a way to get specimens from West Africa and the Americas back to Europe. And so looking at that history, I did research for the poem after writing it, sort of confirming, what I wrote is actually factually correct, by reading a particular book called The Slave Ship: A Human History by Marcus Rediker. And so reading this book, it talks about in detail the Middle Passage and what happened in terms of, say, it's a horrible way to put it, but sort of, I guess, the trade of human beings and the procedures of readying them for market. And it talks about how palm oil was used by the slave traders in this process. And so that kind of opened up an idea in my head of, okay, well, this very common ingredient by cuisine has a much bigger role, not only in West African culture, but also in this very dark chapter of human history. And so from there, that's kind of how the poem expanded. And yeah, so I guess I really took sort of a deep dive, looking into this connection in natural history and the slave trade. And that sort of sparked this other poem completely, really trying to look at, okay, we have these common ingredients. What's also their bigger history? Kind of what do they tell us about, these different chapters of human history, both, say, positive and horribly negative. Yeah, so that's kind of where my awareness came from.
And just as an aside, there's an interesting portion in Moqueca Chronicle in which you talk about, and do correct me if I'm wrong, in which you talk about trying to find a particular white fish that's only particular to Brazil in Berlin. And having lived in Germany, I know the challenges of trying to make, certain dishes and the foods aren't there, and, trying to find equivalents. So that was something that resonated very much with me personally. Joshua, was this history on your mind as well when you were writing It's the Little Barbecue Joints I Like?
I think so. If not immediately, then definitely from a subconscious perspective. I mean, as you've said, American barbecue, has its roots in slavery. And you look post-emancipation, most of the prominent pit masters in this country were freed black slaves, right? And so barbecue has this really complicated relationship with slavery, where barbecue embodies this incredible amount of violence on one hand, I think, both in terms of like the unspeakable violence of slavery, and also it's kind of a violent way of cooking at the same time, right? But at the same time, paradoxically, there's a lot of community there. And so in my poem, I wanted to explore the relationship between, this violence, either from an historical standpoint and, the act of cooking, and this communal aspect of it. I was reading something really cool about the politics of barbecue. And what I didn't know, I knew that a lot of elections took place over barbecue and a lot of political speeches, but I didn't know a lot of influential slave rebellions also took place over barbecue, like Nat Turner's rebellion. Apparently it took place or was organized over barbecue. So barbecue has this incredibly revolutionary, or it can, rebellious aspect to it too, but at the same time, it has this connection to violence. And so while that historical reality was always present, I was looking at the ways to complicate that and lean towards how can I bring that violence back into more community, I suppose. And I was thinking of Honoré Fanone Jeffers' The Gospel of Barbecue. Jake Adam York, his poem Grace does this really well, where he interrogates like the historical realities surround barbecue as well. So I do try to bring that in, and that's always kind of the fore of my mind as well.
Your mention of Nat Turner, which and that's a very interesting fact. I had no idea that barbecue served as a means over which people gathered and discussed rebellion. Typically, we're taught or told that, because as many of us know, Nat Turner was a preacher, or an informal preacher. Typically we're told that the scripture was the key focal point over that gathering, and that's true too. But it makes one wonder if that antebellum tradition of Black people gathering to read scripture, to discuss scripture, those who could read, going over scripture with other enslaved people, if our current tradition of people having cookouts after church maybe came out of that. Just it's something to think about, and something I was wondering about as you were talking. Recently, in the United States anyway, we've started talking more about food justice. And my last question gets me thinking a little bit about the ethics of food production. Still, many of us don't think much about where food comes from, and also about issues related to food scarcity. Again, primarily in the United States. Was that a topic, that being food justice, a topic that the two of you were thinking about at all as you were writing these poems, starting with Brandon?
Oh, for me, I would say, sort of in the more, say, local terms you're kind of defining, it really wasn't, but I was thinking about it maybe in a more, say, global or international context, because dinde oil is palm oil. And we know that palm oil has a very, I would say bad reputation, but deservedly bad reputation. There's many issues with palm oil. But at the same time, it is also a staple of West African cuisine, and sort of this cuisine from Bahia, and as part of their culture. And, it becomes a very, for me, kind of a conundrum, because, how did palm oil get in Southeast Asia? Well, through colonizers. It was not the fault of West Africans or Black people from Brazil. This wasn't their choice. So it's a question, and so this came to mind while I was thinking about this, because I remember having a conversation with a few friends and saying, I'm cooking Brazilian food, and, well, what are the ingredients in Brazilian food? Oh, well, dinde oil. Okay, what's dinde oil? Well, it's palm oil. Oh, you shouldn't be using that. It's like, okay, well, do you mean me as a non-Brazilian cooking this, or do you mean Brazilians also shouldn't be cooking with palm oil? Because, this is their culture, so yes, there's like really issues with palm oil and its production for both wildlife and the people working in these plantations. But at the same time, this is an ingredient really central to like the cuisine of different cultures. And so like, how do you balance that out? And so I thought about trying to put this into Moqueca Chronicle. That seemed to, like, almost, it deserves its own poem. I mean, this seems to be such a complicated, nuanced thing that, yeah, I think I would have been trying to pack in way too much into one poem to try to get at that, plus 500 years of history. So yeah, so for Moqueca Chronicle, this kind of sort of more global justice or balancing of culture and, say, conservation and these things was in my mind, but I think I should say that for a different poem in the future.
Well, if you don't mind, I would make the argument that food justice is intrinsic to that poem, because you're dealing with the Middle Passage.
Okay,
yeah.
historical justice. That's, yeah. Well, in that sense, yes. I'm not really commenting upon, say, present day situations, but in terms of historical acknowledgement of the past, yeah, that is absolutely central to Moqueca Chronicle, and some of the other things I have in my head. So I guess this thing like sort of looking at the past, acknowledging the past, and somehow trying to come to terms or say reckon with the past. In that sense, yes, it is about justice. But in terms of say the present moment, yeah, I guess my work is not really going at that.
And Joshua, is this something that you were thinking about? And just to help to broaden the context a little bit, when we talk about food justice, it really doesn't have to be central to this time, because I realize that again, in the American context anyway, this is a relatively recent term, and we're still learning how to talk about it. And generally, when we do talk about it, we talk about it in a present day context. But just like the Africans who were brought to the New World to tend to cash crops, we're still dealing with situations in which people are underpaid, if not if paid at all, to deliver foods to our tables. Joshua, what do you think?
For this particular poem, I don't think that it was I don't think I was exploring that theme directly, but I think, as you said a minute ago, I think all food poetry in some sense is tied to food justice in some way. If you're looking to explore the historical truths about a food, and nearly all foods for the most part can be complicated by either political, economic, or social instances of the past, right? Complications and things that happened in the past. So I think like all food is tied to some form of justice. In this poem, I think more so tied to class. I was looking at, I'm always fascinated with smaller restaurants, mom and pop shops that, speaking of the pandemic, a lot of those places were closed down, right? You have these big kind of chain restaurants coming in and destroying like the local flavors and cuisines, especially in rural areas. And so I think about that a lot. Of course, I think about farm workers tremendously. And having worked in a few restaurants, I think about the discrepancy between front of the house and back of the house, especially from a guest perspective. When most people eat out at nice restaurants, you see the front of the house. What you're not seeing is the back of the house, which is, the kitchens I've worked in, predominantly people of color, marginalized folks. And that part of the restaurant experience doesn't get the observance. People don't see these people as much as they should. And so I'm interested in the ways in which, we can, like you said, kind of bring to light people and cultures in the food industry that are marginalized or that are relegated, pushed to the side.
So I'm going to close out with a question that I usually ask poets toward the end. Who are some of your key literary influences? Brandon.
For this particular poem, the main influence that I kind of had floating in my head was a Brazilian poet named Carlos Drummond de Andrade. And so there's a particular poem called The Table, where he's going through like basically a giant family dinner. And he's basically there with all of his relatives, both alive and dead. And they're all sort of communing, getting together. And it's a poem that takes its time. And that's kind of what I drew from it. So this is a very big family meal. And it's a very long poem, just taking its time building up to its conclusion. And I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about 500 years of history for this poem. So I'm just going to take my time as well and sort of go through this and, take as long as I need to get this out of my, tell the story or, put this piece together. And I guess some of the plainness, the complexity of the sentences, I guess also were inspired by this particular poem. So I would say in general, Drummond de Andrade is a major influence, not just for this poem, but in general. I would say also Whitman, Robert Hayden, Gwendolyn Brooks. I don't know. I mean, I can name many. Yeah.
Joshua?
Thomas Lux, for sure. As we said earlier, I love Phil Levine, Yusef Komunyakaa. Read a lot of Yusef Komunyakaa. In terms of just like food writers, love Jim Harrison. Anthony Bourdain, who else? B.H. Fairchild, read a lot of B.H. Fairchild, some Honoré Fanon Jeffers when I'm digging through like really good food poems and barbecue poems, especially. Really started reading a lot of Rita Dove. I never read a lot of Rita Dove before. So yeah, I've been reading just a lot of different poets and writing in different styles, and a lot of food writing at the moment too.
Okay, it's giving us the countdown, so I want to get to the readings. Josh, I'll give you a choice of what you want to read.
Sure.
But I'd like to end with you because both of your poems are shorter. Which one do you think you'll do?
I'll do It's the Little Barbecue Joints.
That makes sense because we've talked about that one. Okay, so now we're going to end with the reading of the poems that we've discussed today. Brandon will kindly read us Moqueca Chronicle, and Joshua will close us out with It's the Little Barbecue Joints I Like. Brandon, I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you. Moqueca Chronicle. Moqueca is a Brazilian stew typically made with fish. Notably, the variant from the state of Bahia has an African influence that is reflected in two ingredients, dinde oil and coconut milk. Having traveled with me to Berlin from a bookstore in Sao Paulo, after a first taste in Belo Horizonte, a concoction of fish and coconut milk. Grand measures of chili and ginger each have a turn on a cutting board where my hands ply the blade, while dried shrimp and peppercorns, coriander seeds and turmeric await them in the mortar. Small and flavorful morsels recounting ancestral homelands, origins and destinations retraced with the ink of a recipe's ingredients. With a tilt of a measuring spoon, I drizzle a vermeil ribbon of oil to smooth the pestil's grindings. A scant teaspoon of Atlantic Africa carried across ocean in casks stashed in below decks fetid and coffin dark. Stirred into horse beans and dabadab, passed out in crews to manacled hands. Smeared over wounds masked with caustic, 10 days out from the Bay of All Saints. Rubbed over irons and the cat's scars to boost the price of black skin. Offloaded along the coast of Bahia, where, amidst transplant groves of dinde and coconut, firelight-licking chains and window bars, it sizzled in a senzala's cooking pot. A bit of oil collected under my nails marks my touch yellow as I mix salt and a lime's juice with soft cubes of bells, white fish workaround for Berlin's lack of Brazilian fish. 2 handfuls of crawfish tails throw in, a touch of my birthland, recalling shells boiled red and dumped across newsprint. Schoolyard discoveries of mud chimneys constructed overnight by industrious claws. The oil's red fragrance wafts over, from dicings of tomatoes and onions, mortar-made paste, chili and garlic all vocal from the stove's eye. I pour into the pan a liter of coconut milk. Small lake wandered with Portuguese profiteers and spice seekers, on carrack and caravel from Indian beaches, finding route along the Gulf of Guinea to join the company of rice, cowpeas, and okra before continuing along routes of Brazil-bound slavers to commingle with the Natu, cashews, and cassava, where centuries after this journey, setting out through cookbook pages, it gains a foothold in my kitchen. After so many times cooking this dish, I can recite its preparation in full. Now, I annotate the steps recorded in a single page. Its succinct ink belies circuitous creation to pinpoint my own touches in the margins. Manning a spoon, I wash the turmeric, marble the coconuts white with yellow, each circle of my hand for the conjuring a hue from monk's robes to overtake the pan, its full brilliance coaxed out with a simmer. Bringing the pan to a greater boil, I add the fish to the vibrant and sputtering cacophony, the melding cauldron redolent with worlds old and new, spice caravans of the Silk Road and Sahel, the aftermath of crusades, the ambitions of empires, conquistadors and the conquered,
unknown sails and unnamed lands dotting horizons, saffron fortunes, food offerings to Orishas. Deeper than all this, like an anchor down at the bottom of this thickening sauce, the delight of tasting and embracing new flavors. Attested to by a tourist's first ignorant bite on a rainy August night in Belo Horizonte. To finish, I toss in red and green rings of bell peppers, wedges of onions and tomatoes, and after a few minutes cooking, lastly dust its yellow with green handfuls of scallion and cilantro, rich in its taste with 2 red tablespoons of oil. Spooning the moqueca over rice, my plate holds an heirloom from a continent estranged, recovered despite history's capsizing swells 3 or 4 times. Dispersing birthright of diasporal millions, arrived and born in the forced homeland, the dinde and coconut I savor and share, their scent filling my home as they continue their odyssey, carried by the full stomachs departing my apartment at evening's end. Each dinner, a minuscule and fundamental footnote, feeding their oceanic chronicle. Thank you.
Joshua?
Okay. All right. All right. So it's the little barbecue joints I like after Thomas Lux. It's the little barbecue joints I like with their rusted sidings and smoke leaking into December when there's no comfort but brisket brimming on the bone, splatting against parking lots and constellations of stains. I like them in the South, especially in towns named for nuisances, Muskrat, Mississippi, Tarantula, Tennessee, towns carved from fatback and cold cuts, from the knowledge that death comes quick when aromas slip from our lives. Unincorporated, without grievances, their patrons dream of vinegar and pepper flakes flaming tongues with ambition. Little bigger than shacks, doors raw-boned, and 2 more fights from blowing off their hinges, these spots are porcine churches churning flavor sermons beneath pink neon tubes. And so I enter them with reverence for the swine and the bolt stunner's speed, for the music of cracklings crumbling in parchment and the holy water of molasses, for even that which I will not eat, the maw and the cloved feet, and the offal that runs through the mind of the priest as they hunch over this converted propane tank that is so American in its battered beauty, in its urge to bless this skin by splitting it open.
Thank you so much to the both
Thank
of you
you.
for taking the time.